We finally got some exciting news about Sony cinema cameras. But it's from Blackmagic. It's been a very quiet announcement, but Blackmagic have announced that BRAW is coming soon to Sony cameras. That is something that I'm very excited indeed. Now in the announcement, it was a tech demo at IBC, very understated, no one really seemed to talk about it very much, but they did mention it on an interview with ProAV. There was a live stream, make sure you go and check that out. It's a great chat talking about all the Blackmagic cameras that are coming out, including the update to the Video Assist, which means it's going to be able to work with Sony cameras recording BRAW. Now, initially it sounds like it's only going to be for the Sony FX6 and FX9 in Q4 of this year. However, in that live stream, they did make it clear that they are looking at the FX3 as well, and that's very likely to come soon after. Unfortunately, for those that are shooting on the Alpha series like the A7S III, it sounds like that is a different engineering team at Sony, and they haven't really had any discussions with Blackmagic, and it's not coming anytime soon. So, annoying and frustrating, especially as they all use the same sensor, but that said, I think understandable because there should be a bit of a definition difference between the cinema line and the photography line of the Alpha series. So why am I so excited about the idea of having BRAW on my Sony camera, and why I think it's such a big deal that they announced it right now? Well, obviously BRAW is much more flexible. If you've played around with this format ever before, if you've used a Blackmagic camera, it's the one thing that I absolutely love about Blackmagic cameras. The codec to work with is just so nice to use. You've got so much more flexibility when it comes to color grading. Of course, you can adjust your ISO, you can adjust your white balance, but also as a RAW format, it just edits very smoothly in DaVinci Resolve. I think that's the really key thing here. There's no real sacrifice that you're making by shooting BRAW over a more compressed format. It also actually isn't that large in file size either. Of course, you can go up to the highest quality setting and the files will be very large indeed if you really need that. However, if you're shooting more compressed formats such as Q5 or 1:12, which still produces amazing results, and to be honest is what the vast majority of B-roll that I've ever shot has been at one of those two options, then still the quality is great, but the file sizes are much smaller compared to anything else out there when it comes to RAW. Now for me, the idea of pairing the BRAW with all the wonderful Sony features such as the low light ability and the autofocus is absolutely incredible. I think it just ticks so many boxes. I think it is a massive upgrade if you already own a Sony. I think it's quite reasonable for a lot of people who are looking at the new cameras coming out, such as the Pixus, such as the Canon C80 and C400, as well as the price drop from the Red Komodo X as well, that perhaps if you already own an FX6 and FX3, you might be starting to be tempted by these other brands. After all, they all have internal RAW, which is a big upgrade from what the Sonys offer. That said, although this isn't quite internal, and there's pros and cons to that, this is a massive upgrade which would certainly extend the life out of your Sony camera, and actually I would argue in some ways actually leapfrogs the Sonys back ahead of even these new cameras that are coming out. Now I mentioned about the pros and cons of internal versus external RAW. Generally, I much prefer recording things internally. I think it's just much smoother. You don't have to worry about the cable coming out and causing issues, and it's just a much nicer shooting experience. That said, I think if it's a case of using one of these RAW codecs from the likes of Sony or Canon versus shooting something like BRAW, I'd always go BRAW. BRAW is a much nicer codec to work with. I don't really ever use the Canon RAW on the C70 because the file sizes are so large and they just don't edit well at all. It's very clunky to work with and just not enjoyable like BRAW is. So for me, although it's frustrating you'd have to use an external recorder, and of course I would love it internally, that's never going to happen. But having BRAW to me is more important on an external device versus having an internal codec from the likes of Sony or Canon, which I think for just most people isn't quite as workable. Is this something that's going to keep you with Sony? That's a big question right there. Certainly, if you have a Sony camera right now and you're looking for a new monitor, I think the Video Assist is a great option to go for. It's a good monitor anyway. It's a great monitor, very bright, and now you're going to have this added ability of B-RAW in the future. I think it certainly makes sense to pick one up indeed. If you were going for one of the other brands, perhaps maybe you're going to switch to the Canon C80 or the C400, Are you going to carry on switching at this point, or has this tempted you to stay with your Sony setup? Is this a reason to not dismiss Sony? Finally, is this enough from Sony? Do we need to see more? Do we need to see a Mark II from the FX6 and FX3 where we have internal RAW and other features that perhaps we'd like to see on these cameras? Or do you think this is enough to breathe new life into the Sony lineup to keep it going for another year or two without any temptations to move elsewhere? Leave your comments down below. I'd love to know what you think. Thank you very much for watching. And if you want to see more of my videos talking about what I think should be in the next Sony FX3, then make sure you check out this video right up here.